Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for being here. We're here to discuss Broadband for All, strengthening digital equity, and we have a great panel lined up, and we're going to bring them out right away. First up, we have Lonnie Ingram, the Vice President of Verizon's Smart Communities organization. Next up, we have Steve Benjamin, Mayor of Columbia, South Carolina. We have Jesse Davis, who's the Managing Director of the Technology, Media, Telecom Group at Citigroup. And finally, we have Jeff Nordhaus, who is the Executive Vice President of the Innovation and Broadband Program at the Empire State Development Corporation. Thank you guys all for being here. You know what, Lonnie? I think I'm going to take this.
Want me to sit over there? Okay, no
Thank
worries.
you. Just so I can really grill everybody down the row.
There we go.
All right. I know all of you probably already know Mayor Benjamin already, but we wanted to start out just by doing a quick introduction to kind of explain how everybody approaches this topic. So why don't you kick it off, Mayor?
Steve Benjamin, the Mayor of Columbia, South Carolina for the last 8 years, and I've had about 72 hours as President of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, our organization founded in 1932, serving the needs of meeting American cities and advocating for public policy to help grow our cities. This space, obviously, broadband is the future of America. If we're indeed going to be continue to be the most prosperous and powerful and influential democratic nation in the history of the world, then we've got to start building out 21st century or 22nd century infrastructure. Much of the infrastructure that we're dealing with in our cities still to this day is literally 19th century infrastructure. How do we prepare ourselves to be competitive on the world stage is the real discussion here, and love talking today about ways in which we can do that through strong, healthy partnerships with not only our governmental partners, NGOs, but certainly with the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you. Jesse.
Hi, Jesse Davis, or I'm a Managing Director in the Investment Banking Group at Citi. I've been covering the telecom space for the last 18 years, 13 of them at Citi, where I work with a lot of the consumer-facing companies that we all know, the large telcos, but also the infrastructure companies behind that support the fiber infrastructure that connects the cities and the towers and the data centers, the tower center operators that enable the mobile communications, as well as the data centers that store the massive amounts of data that created and enable a lot of the connectivity and the unique capabilities that we're here to talk about today.
Lonnie.
Hi there, I'm Lonnie Ingram. I'm the Vice President of our Smart Communities Group at Verizon. Been really passionate about the smart community space for several years, a little over 13 years now. And really our goal is to be able to see how we can get technology to improve the lives of the citizens and communities all across the United States. And we have some fantastic opportunities to be able to do that. Leveraging the infrastructure, leveraging our capabilities to be able to provide more in a very equitable fashion across the communities, and also really thinking about innovation and job growth and some of the futuristic capabilities of what is possible once we lay that foundation.
And Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff Nordhaus, Executive Vice President of Innovation and Broadband at New York State. And in that capacity, I was nominated by Governor Cuomo to run the new New York Broadband program, which is the largest and most ambitious state broadband initiative of its kind in the country. We have a $500 million fund, which we recently just deployed. And the goal of the program is to make sure that every New Yorker has access to broadband. And we define speeds very ambitiously as well, with 100 megabit speed or better for all of our projects. And in the most rural and remote areas, 25 megabits is acceptable. So look forward to talking to you, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, let's get right into the discussion. I wanted to ask you, Jeff, a little bit more about that program. Can you talk about the genesis for it and the need in New York for this kind of broadband build out?
Sure, thank you. 3 years ago, New York State had received some additional funds that the governor was looking to deploy into infrastructure. And as we look, and the mayor talked about this a minute ago, we look not only to traditional infrastructure, bridges and roads, but also to the infrastructure of the future, which is broadband. And we have the view in New York State that and across the country. But here in New York, obviously, where we're running, we're operating things, we believe broadband is no longer a luxury, it's a necessity. Some, when you go to various conferences, actually think it's a human right, and I think that's a very strong argument as well, because in today's world, you can't really participate in the modern economy in any way without access to broadband. Kids can't do homework, can't apply to college, can't apply for a job, can't perform your everyday life without access to broadband. So many, many stories that we've seen as we've begun to roll out broadband about the benefits that come from broadband and obviously the problems of not having broadband. Many communities in New York State still in 2018 don't have access to broadband. So we have 8.1 million households in New York. According to our data, when we started our program, about 70% of those households, believe it or not, only 70, have access to broadband at 100 megabits or better. Those are, generally speaking, all the houses in Long Island have access, at least one provider. We're talking mostly about fixed lines. Obviously, wireless is in addition to that. But on the fixed line side, most of Long Island is covered. Most of New York City is covered from an infrastructure point of view, which doesn't mean every household can necessarily afford broadband. We don't talk about the digital divide in this concept. That's a separate issue. But in terms of access to the infrastructure, that if you have the ways, means, and capabilities that you could access broadband, so just like a road, the infrastructure is there. But upstate, only about 30 to 40% of upstate households have access to broadband. And so that left a gap of 2.4 million households in terms of the need. Many of those were covered by Charter Communications. So when they merged with Time Warner, the state negotiated about 2 million of those households to be upgraded at no cost to our program to broadband. And then we structured what we call a reverse auction. So we identified all the unserved areas, and then we auctioned off a subsidy effectively. So we are forming public-private partnerships where the state will pay somewhere between 50 to 80% of the capital expenditures for a provider to build out a community that doesn't have any broadband. And we will provide that subsidy to the lowest bidder. In other words, the company that will provide fiber optic broadband to that community at the lowest state cost. So we just announced, we did 3 rounds, and we just announced that we have fiber now either in place or committed to be in place over the next couple of years to 99% of all New Yorkers. So we're very excited about that. We're working hard to make sure all those projects are delivering on time and on budget. But we think it's an exciting program. It's a model that other states are following, and we're happy to be able to talk about it today, so thank you.
And how do you ensure that that broadband is affordable to the residents?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the program needed to incentivize private companies to build this out. So it wasn't like we passed a law and said, you must cover this area. This is unlike actually the traditional telco world. In the old telco world, we had concept of universal service where companies had to build out to every home. So you had to have a telephone, just like you have to have electricity. The phone companies had to actually build out and connect every wireline, not wireless, but wireline business. And if you look on your phone bill or your cable bill, you'll always see your bill, and then you'll see about 17 other items below that. Those are going into the Universal Service Fund to fund that. In the world of broadband, that doesn't exist. So broadband has tended to grow out from the cable companies who tended to build out the downtown areas, and then they would slowly, according to their franchise, go a little bit further, but they wouldn't have any coverage in the outer areas. So as a result, we needed to make it economic. We needed to make it attractive enough that companies would bid in, but we didn't have subsidies to do it. But we did feel, to your point, that at the same time as we needed to make it a viable economic proposition, that using state dollars to build out the network, it needed to be affordable. And it wouldn't be something where we would want to fund a project and have any kind of excessive price as part of price gouging, if you will. So we put as part of our program that every provider who participates has to offer a broadband tier, which we define as at least 25 megabits for $60 or less. And they're free to bundle, they can add video, they can add other things into that, but they have to at least offer the 25 megabits for $60, and then other packages can follow from there.
Okay, great. Mayor Benjamin, can you talk a little bit about what's going on in Columbia in terms of making sure broadband is both accessible and affordable to your residents?
Well, sure. We're in the infancy of developing some significant public-private partnerships. The reality is that oftentimes in the municipal sphere, people are afraid of P3s. Pilots that may have happened 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and now see 30 years ago on sanitation or water or sewer have left people somewhat jaded. And the reality is that if in fact we're going to try and deploy hundreds of billions or probably trillions of dollars worth of infrastructure across this country, it's going to require solid, thoughtful P3s that work for cities. And those partnerships that work for cities mean that, yes, we have to have good, strong business-to-business opportunities in our urban cores, but we have to make sure that we use the levers of public policy to also make sure that those benefits stretch out to the rest of our community. So we're engaged in some great conversations right now that have yet to be made public. In the interim, we've worked closely with our planning staff to lay out a regulatory scheme that allows for the deployment not of fiber but of small cell infrastructure. We got ahead of the curve. We feel very strongly in our city, and I think as of today, every single application has been made by the various partners has been approved in our city. Many of you have been watching or involved in the various battles that have been happening either at the FCC, in Congress, state legislatures, state courts on the preemption issue of those who want access to public rights of way. A lot of cities, of course, not only protecting the aesthetic value of the cities, but also public safety issues. And there's some major issues. And some cities are also seeking to monetize it in a way that they can then use those resources to meet other real municipal needs. But it's led to a significant regulatory and litigation logjam all across the country. And we've got to find ways in which we can roll out ways like we addressed it in Columbia. We work closely with providers. They work closely with our staff. And we've approved applications for small cell deployment some as quickly as 7 days. On the long side, if someone's waiting for more than 30 days, then they hadn't done their due diligence, and we haven't had a real dialogue. But we work closely with industry, recognizing that the way for us to succeed and our citizens to succeed is for us to attract private sector capital, treat it well, it grows, and then we're able to use those resources to meet some significant public sector needs. The challenges, as we all know, that American society and maybe global society is facing, again, watching our robust economy just continue to explode, but the benefits of that economy are, again, enduring to those of us who have capital, not necessarily those of us who are working hard every single day. The issues of income volatility are very real. Families are not being able to advance as fast as they possibly can. And without access to quality broadband, it makes it that much more difficult. It makes it more difficult for our children to learn, for kids to do homework, and it's got to become an essential part, a sacrosanct part of what we need to do in American cities. We're working hard to continue to focus on traditional infrastructure to meet the $5 trillion deficit that America may have. If in fact we're going to work to build out this new infrastructure, there may need to be new tools and certainly an enhanced emphasis on real public-private partnerships that helps us accelerate this development. But it's got to be done in a way that allows us to grow together and make sure that a mayor who, again, lives in a city that cannot be gerrymandered, a city that has to be responsive to the needs of all of its citizens, that helps us meet the needs of all of our citizens. And that requires some real partnership, and I think a lot of the brain power in this room to help us figure out how to skin that cat.
Lonnie, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about kind of jumping off of the small cell issue and kind of the push to 5G and what that's going to look like, and in doing that, ensuring that communities don't get left behind. But you have to start somewhere, and I know Verizon has started at Sacramento. I was hoping you can tell us a little bit about that project and kind of how that public-private partnership came together.
Yeah, absolutely. 5G is going to be transformational in so many ways. We have the ability to do so much more with the communications infrastructure that will be built out. The use cases that we're talking about are just scratching the surface of what we're really going to be seeing over the next several years against that technology. So we're very excited about that. In order to truly deploy 5G and to take full advantage of it, however, we truly believe that it's going to take a very strong relationship with the mayors and with the community, so that we can ensure that we're putting them in the right places, that we're taking full advantage of it, and we're also laying out other technologies that are required for the future growth and aspirations and needs of the community. One of the great things about doing this in Sacramento, the mayor there had a very strong vision for what he wanted. He wanted to be able to create this as the capital of tech, of food, and of art, which I think is a fantastic initiative. And in his organization, they were very focused on how to meet those goals. So when we did the public-private partnership, we focused not just on here's what we're going to do with small cells, or here's how we're going to lay the fiber, or here's how we're actually going to be doing some of those technical decisions, but we really kind of started the conversation around what are you trying to change in your community. One of the big important things, for example, was digital inclusion, very important aspect of it. And we met that with Wi-Fi capabilities that we're able to provide for free in disadvantaged communities. We were able to meet that by doing STEM programs and a lot of community efforts that were there to be able to pull in the individuals that we really want to see participate in the economy going forward. Traffic was a really big issue. We focused on solutions around there. Public safety was a big issue. And so we focused on those and created a partnership that allowed us to meet those kinds of futuristic needs of the community. And the mayor and his team then helped us be able to deploy the equipment faster, more efficiently, and we kind of just got on the same side of the table, so to speak. We got on one side of the table, and on the other side of the table, what we're really going after are all the challenges and problems that we want to fix in the community. So as opposed to a traditional vendor-customer relationship where each one of us is trying to kind of compete against each other in many ways, we said, we're going to help each other and we're going to go after those common goals. It has been an incredible experience and one that we're really working on replicating around the country.
I want to bring Jesse into the conversation too. Maybe we can expand that a little bit and talk about, cities like Sacramento. How can smart city initiatives kind of position themselves to best benefit from 5G rollout to make sure that they get selected? What do you think needs to be done, Jesse?
Yeah, it's a good question. I really enjoy hearing Mayor Benjamin and Lonnie's perspectives on that because, smart cities require connectivity, and the connectivity is both wired and wireless. And when you think about wireless and the infrastructure required there, it is small cells, it is fiber going down the street, access to ducts, and the companies that I talk to that are responsible for that infrastructure, being able to access that throughout relationships with the municipalities, with the providers is integral in deciding how they deploy their capital and how to deploy the capital to be most efficient for their return on capital, but also that's interrelated with the success of the city too. They want to find cities where they have forward-thinking mayors. Why Sacramento or Columbia are leading initiatives on that, and some the places where the providers invest their money first. They've got IP traffic in the U.S. doubled in the last 2 years. Mobile traffic is supposed to triple in the next 3 years. Think about our household habits and what we do. That investment's there and is happening, so we know that's happening. And so the infrastructure investment has to happen. There's approximately $50 billion of capital amongst the 4 large wireless companies that's being invested in infrastructure each year. It's a lot of money, and deploying that in the most efficient manner is high on their priorities. So public-private partnerships, a mayor and a team that's going to sit down and can work across functions. I hear them discuss, it's difficult to integrate, to work through a waste management department, a public transportation department, and a public works department, and having someone who's on the same side of the table helps develop them as to where they want to put the capital to work, and then also will enable those cities to have the right smart city infrastructure to make the cities safer for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually, Mayor Benjamin, would you want to tell us a little bit about how you do it in Columbia in terms of making sure there's one point person, or how do you kind of ease the way to make sure that Columbia providers think of your city as one that they can work with?
Sure. And it's interesting because obviously we have a number of mid-sized cities across the country that represent significant opportunity. I remember telling Antonio Villaraigosa, and he was the mayor of Los Angeles, that his budget deficit was larger than my budget. So we don't have infinite resources, and every city doesn't have a CTO or chief innovation officer or someone who's spending 24 hours a day focusing on these issues. So you really have to gravitate towards those who have certain skill sets and have the ability to convene a group even when you're not there. That's one of our deputy city managers is fairly talented in that space, and we're in the midst of an advanced metering infrastructure build out. So he's become the person, along with our chief a CIO, that we rely on in this space. But it has required us getting everyone literally around the table. I mean, having our solid waste guys, along with our public works folks, along with our tech folks, and some people who know each other. They've been colleagues and comrades for a long time, but who really interact in a cross-functional way in identifying. We have our chief of police at the table and our chief of the fire department. What are you doing that has some synchronicity, and how can we package this all up? And I will say this. We are doing, I think, some pretty cool things in our city government. We are in our infancy, but from the outside looking in, our citizens are demanding these things. I mean, our citizens are hungry for the new innovation economy. They're seeing things happening all around the globe in 200 different countries that they come from, 90 different languages, and they want to see these advances at home. So we're under the microscope to deliver for them on what it takes to be a place that aspires to be the most talented, educated, and entrepreneurial city in America. But it literally means that we get everyone around the table, and we figure out what's working, what's not, what are some opportunities that we can help each other advance on, and then how we can package this up into some very strategic partnerships, leveraging each partnership as much as possible to get to a place where broadband access is ubiquitous, where we have small cell infrastructure built out, where we have our I mean, it's amazing. If you guys know how many emails or texts I get about parking on a regular basis, or it's just some very basic things that our citizens are literally way out ahead of us. And what we aspire to do over the next couple of years at the U.S. Conference of Mayors is to really not necessarily turn a bunch of mayors into subject matter experts, although there are some who are incredibly savvy, but to indeed turn them into informed proselytizers, as exactly if in fact you take two cities that are similarly situated, and one mayor just gets it and decides he's going to work and with his colleagues and his co-workers at the city to enhance access in that city versus the mayor who doesn't. In 10 years, those will be two very different cities. And I'll say this and then I'll be quiet. If in fact your city does not have a focus on inclusion, if you're not an inclusive city, then you'll never be a smart city. You'll never be a smart city. And this constant incessant focus on inclusion is not just for show, it's not just for us bleeding hearts, it is just a reality. If you're not bringing the entirety of the city along with you as you advance, then all of the other challenges in public health, in crime and educational advancement or lack thereof become that much worse, and you'll never advance. You'll have some really fancy infrastructure, but you'll never be the city that you want to be.
Jeff, did you want to?
Yeah, just jump in for a minute. I think it's a great point, obviously, on the inclusion, and also just coming back to the capital point. And I think, having spent a little bit of time here over the last 2 days, it's very interesting to attend a Smart Cities conference, and you just discussed a little bit about what does it mean to be a smart city. And I think there's so many, we almost, I think for next year could suggest a panel of like, what is a smart city? And people talking about what that means. It's almost like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I think the smart cities is, there are so many features of being a smart city, whether it's smart parking, whether it's energy, whether it's traffic management. We were talking about smart asphalt, where sensors can be put into the actual asphalt to detect traffic. But I think at the underpinning of a lot of it is connectivity. I think there are some, LED is very, very important, but a lot of the features and aspects of, whether it's traffic management, getting to the right place, whether it's the right app, requires connectivity. requires both the fixed line broadband, but it requires the small cell, and that's why New York not only is committed to, with the largest state program on fixed line, but is also very committed to 5G, and Verizon's obviously the largest player here in New York in that. And I think, dealing with a lot of providers and a lot of cities, which we do, I think that the providers are really looking for two things. One is, in addition to capital, which is essential for all this, I think they need some clarity on the pricing. And I think there's a tension between the cities and all negotiating their individual single deals that every city wants based on their need, their finances, the expertise. So there's a time and an inefficiency for the providers to go and have extensive negotiations with every single city. And at the same time, there's very important issues around permitting. This is true on broadband, and this is true in wireless as well. A lot of the times, the best thing government can do is get out of the way and let the private sector do their job. And so we think it's very important to streamline the permitting process. Our Public Service Commission has actual regulations around how much time. So we actually propose, there's a bill that's now been circulated, which actually proposes a statewide standard for pricing, a suggested pricing for what it should be for a small cell to attach to an antenna or a rooftop, which we think will significantly save time on the negotiation, and also for the time to approve the permitting. So I think for, obviously towns have their own sovereign, decision making that they want to go through, but I think from the experience of working with a lot of providers, the more the state and the cities can do to streamline and make it easy for companies like Verizon to deploy these things, I think it's going to help us stay competitive and allow the citizens to enjoy the benefit of that service.
I think it's important. I mean, I agree. As I've indicated, we've streamlined in our city the process, and it's worked well, I think, for our corporate partners. But however, streamlining does not mean controlling the rights of way, and that's the major challenge. If in fact a corporate partner is allowed to erect small cells anywhere at any time at its own behest, does that partner also take on the responsibility of making sure that public safety concerns are being met, or aesthetic concerns are being met in our historic districts? The needs in New York City versus Ossining or Yonkers, this may be very different. But yes, we do need to streamline so we can accelerate the deployment of small cells. But some of the battles we've seen going on in state legislatures, and this is a preemption argument that goes well beyond the delivery of technological infrastructure on a number of different fronts, leaves a lot to be desired. And I think this is an opportunity maybe over the next year for us working with the U.S. Conference of Mayors to spend some more time around the table, not at the FCC or at BDAC, but places where we're all sitting in the room as equals. Honestly, I think if we pilot some ideas in different cities that make sense, that allow folks just to monetize the growth and development of our infrastructure, I think we'll be able to show a number of different cities how to get it done, and also a number of our corporate partners how to get it done in a way that reeks of parity. Because I will tell you, as random as it might sound, guys, we still have to pick up the trash. We still have to pay police officers and firefighters to deliver services. I mean, there's some very basic needs that go into being a developed nation, a city in a developed nation that still have to be met, and we have to figure out just kind of where that fine line, that breaking point is.
I want to, on this topic, which I think is a really interesting one, one fight that I've heard a lot is this idea on fees, and should they be cost-based or should they be market-based? And the argument that you hear from some cities is, well, if there's not some kind of digital inclusion part of the deployment, then I'm going to charge market-based fees and use that money to make sure that the broadband that you're building in this well-to-do part of the city is going to be available to maybe cities that, maybe neighborhoods of the city that aren't as wealthy or don't have as much access. Lonnie, I want to talk with you about, it's very expensive to deploy. How do you make sure that you can even offer some kind of digital inclusion portion of the deployment?
No, thank you for that question, and you know, I think it ties into the dialogue that we're having here as well, and I think that again, it kind of really comes down to that partnership and that relationship, to where you can truly understand what that community needs, and there's nobody who feels that more than the mayors, which is why we really want to be able to understand that first and foremost. Where are their biggest areas of need? What are their challenges? How are they planning on bridging that divide and ensuring that all people can participate in the growing economy as they start laying out their initiatives? And then if we go backwards from there into the technologies and then into our ability to deploy that in a way that allows us to scale, in a way that allows us to be able to reach everybody. What we can do is when we broaden that conversation, it allows us to do more with less. So let me give an example. If we were just trying to talk about providing a digital inclusion, a Wi-Fi solution, a broadband solution in one particular area, and that's it, we just wanted to solve that one problem. Generally speaking, you know, a lot of times the ROI may not make sense in that one area. But if you broaden that conversation out and you truly become a partner with the city, and you have the full range of capabilities across a company like a Verizon or any of the large telcos, now all of a sudden we can go through and look at this and say, you know what, help me a little bit on this area because I'm really struggling, and then that'll allow me to be able to have enough funds to put more into this other area. And together, like I said, same side of the table, together we actually are able to tackle those issues. I truly believe if you put the power of the community and the power of some of these large corporations in the same room together working on similar problems, we're going to come up with the right answers. And that to me is a more progressive way of being able to address these issues, because it is expensive. It's got to be something that will work in the long term. And breaking things down into tiny little silos makes it very difficult to make that happen. And honestly, by nature, we're all siloed, right? Cities by nature happen to be that way because you've got a separate police department and a separate education department. You know, sometimes you've got separate budgets, separate electoral positions. We want to be able to do the best we can to work across that, and then also pull the power of the ecosystem into that play as well, so that the mayors don't have to have 20 vendors that they're trying to figure out how to work with and pull that together. You know, we can really help to create a holistic approach from industry and the city to ensure we have a scalable, long-term, you know, model that is not going to fall apart because the economics at its basis just don't make sense.
Jesse, I wanted to ask you, and kind of jumping off of that, you're working with mayors in larger cities and mayors that are savvy enough to understand, like, this is how we need to set a process. But Jesse, if we talk about the prospects for 5G in rural areas and kind of what the build out case is there, and is there a danger of the digital divide kind of getting deeper? Yeah,
it's a great question because, you know, by definition, the rural areas, you know, to reach rural areas with fixed infrastructure requires increased investment. The ROI just doesn't always make sense, which is why there's great programs like Jeff described with the state of New York to, you know, reach some of those areas where the economics may not make sense on their face, you know, for a commercial investment into it. You know, the federal government has their CAF 2 funding where it's, you know, $1.5 billion to reach the, you know, more rural areas. I think an interesting part of this debate, though, or this evolution, is we're at the cusp of 5G. 5G is a very exciting technology. Historically, radio, wireless technology has never had enough reliability, throughput, speed, or connectivity to ever outpace the wired infrastructure. It's just, you know, physically hasn't been capable to do so. 5G may be turning some of that spectrum, turning some of that dynamic on its head. And the capabilities for 5G in the rural areas, I think we all recognize it's going to be invested in the urban areas first. It's where the economic case plays out. But to the extent that you can create wireless connectivity in rural areas, creates the opportunity to bring higher broadband speeds, 25, 50, maybe 100 megabits per second, to areas where you may be stringing, you know, 3 miles of cable to connect 3 households. And the economics of that are really hard. But if you can do that with one tower and connect the 20-mile radius with 50 or 100 megabits of speed, that brings, you know, high-speed internet to the home for every kid who's, you know, their teachers can provide programs on the internet. They can be more engaged in the civic government without going to the local polling station. They can, enables far more things that we take for granted in the, in the cities because there is connectivity everywhere. But in the rural areas, that's not the case. And when you take that to the next level further and think about, the gig economy that we all live in, where people are no longer necessarily working in, necessarily an office space, but to the extent you can have greater connectivity of high-speed connectivity outside of the urban areas, that creates all sorts of implications across, traffic flow, cost of living areas, and, growth opportunities for the rural areas in our country.
Jeff, you have the state broadband program pushing out high-speed connectivity to across the entire state. What do you see as some of the possibilities for maybe some of the smart city initiatives in some of these smaller communities, and where do you see that going?
Right. Well, first I'd like to say that the challenge on wireless is very similar to the challenge in wireline. So I agree with your analysis. I think that as much as we've had good luck and success, I think, pushing fiber out to the rural areas, the challenge still exists in wireless coverage. And a lot of people say, okay, great, I can get it at home, but then I drive out of my house and all of a sudden my cell phone doesn't work. And this is also not only a convenience issue, but it's a safety issue, a public safety issue, especially in the North Country. We have people in cold weather who have accidents, and there's been stories about that. So it's a very important issue to not only provide broadband, but also the wireless. What's interesting about wireless is, and Lonnie could talk more, some of the more advanced technologies actually have smaller propagation characteristics.
Yes.
So some of these new cell features that we hear about, 5G, actually have smaller propagations so that they actually work even worse in rural areas. They work best, so they're like great for adding, if you're going to be here and a lot of people are in Mets or City Stadium and you want to, download, they work for providing additional capacity in smaller areas, but not so much in the rural areas. So that's going to be something we'll have to work on from a technology point of view. The other thing about that, last point on that, is that a lot of people say, well, should we build fiber or should we build wireless or should we build something else? How do we make sure our investment is future-proof, right? And the good thing about all of those technologies, including wireless, is it requires the fiber backhaul. So even no matter where you're putting those antennas, and by the way, if you don't have fiber in those areas, you can't actually deploy the wireless. So I always say all roads kind of lead back to fiber. So as long as you're deploying fiber in these rural areas, I think that you'll be future-proofing that. And I think in terms of how you leverage that for the smart cities of the future, I think that's something that now that we've laid the foundation of the broadband and hopefully more on the wireless side as well, we're going to be looking to have some showcase opportunities in New York State where we want to leverage some of the technologies that were discussed here in this conference, whether it's around the energy grid, whether it's around traffic management, parking management, whether it's around some of the communications technology. We think there's a lot of opportunity, and now that we've laid that foundation, we should see more of that. There's a couple of, I know we have the mayor of Schenectady in the room. I see him here, and he's actually done some very interesting things. Gary McCarthy's done some very interesting things in terms of Schenectady, one of the real leaders in the state at the mayoral level in terms of deploying LED, where he saved 50% of the electric bill in the town and redeployed that into Wi-Fi, into public safety, into ability to download updates for the police department. I don't want to steal your thunder later, Gary, but we see more of the opportunities that Gary's deployed in Schenectady around the state going forward.
Okay, well, I think we have time for one more question, and I want to pose it to Mayor Benjamin, because you recently elected the new leader of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Touched on this a little bit, but since this is Broadband for All, how does digital inclusion rank among priorities for the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and kind of what do you see the organization doing on that front?
It's at the heart of most dialogues I have with our colleagues. Our focus for the next 2 years will be on infrastructure, on innovation, and on inclusion. And I'll say this, a fourth eye, in the words of the prophet Isaiah, come, let us reason together. I believe, indeed, that most of the issues that are being debated in Congress and the FCC, in our state legislatures, battles, I think that having good, strong, reasonable dialogue amongst us, we can solve a lot of those problems together. So I've had more time with Lonnie and Hubert than they probably care to spend with me, but friends at Mobility and Comcast and also a number of our edge providers. We got to spend some more time talking, figuring out ways in which we can create a really good, strong environment for private sector investment that allows our partners to make a lot of money, which is what we want. We want to make sure we watch the American economy grow, and at the very same time, how do we leverage that growth to make sure we meet the needs of all of our citizens? That starts with real robust dialogue, something that doesn't happen in Washington much anymore, so we have to make sure we're doing it in American cities, and U.S. Conference of Mayors wants to provide that table.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you to the audience for your attention, and thank you to the panelists for your insight. This was a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.